I'm joined here by Velina Chakarova, who's the geopolitical strategist at FACE, and Ayoade Alakicha, who's the chair of the Investment Impact Initiative at the G7. And we're going to talk about the broad changes that are happening in the world today, the geopolitical changes mainly, and really how I'd say the dominant Western countries are actually responding to them. I think that's probably the most interesting take. So I'm a macroeconomist by trade. We won't be focusing too much on economics, but economists for our sins, even though we don't admit it, are all historical materialists by default. So we think the economy drives everything. Just to give some kind of overviews of the changes that have taken place recently, China overtook the United States and Europe as the world's largest economy in 2017 on a purchasing power parity basis. The BRICS have overtaken the Western countries as of about 2022. So these are enormous changes. Obviously, they don't completely determine how the geopolitics will follow from that. But I think we're probably in a moment right now where the Western countries are becoming quite aware, especially with the rise of China and so on, that these changes are taking place and they're trying to react to them. So perhaps we'd start with you, Velina, and say something about your views of those reactions, and maybe we can assess them after that.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that I should represent the Western view on the global transformational processes, and I will try to really wrap it up from this perspective, even though that I'm not agreeing with all of, let's say, current strategies and approaches that the West, the collective West, has come up with regarding this transformational process. Now, first and foremost, indeed, we are moving from Western, let's say, Western kind of global system towards a non-Western. I wouldn't say necessarily anti-Western. Yes, in some degrees, to some extent, also anti-Western, but certainly non-Western kind of global system. We do not know exactly what kind of it is going to be in terms of polarization of the system. That means bifurcation of the system or chaotic, volatile multipolarity. We don't know the answer yet, but for sure what we know is that there is a certain structural and cyclical decline on behalf of the West, which is uneven within the collective West regarding the European powers. That is certainly the big problem, not so much on behalf of United States. And United States, facing these realities, is also moving away from the European continent towards the Indo-Pacific, finding new partners, new alliances, and forging, so to say, new strategic formats for that matter. So that's the first big part of it. Second big part is, as you rightfully pointed out, that global system shifts and geopolitical megatrends are very much actually reflecting the emergence or re-emergence, I would say, of global and regional powers in the so-called global South, being in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this is a collective term. My colleague will certainly elaborate on that. And right now we are in this transitional period. We are in between two worlds. The old world is dying, and you struggle actually to survive. But the old world is also struggling to get born. And while we are in this transitionary period, a load of narratives, a load of old paradigms, and a lot of ideas are coming up as to how to cope with this uncertainty. So the uncertainty is the new constant of global geopolitics. That's the first takeaway on my side. The second big takeaway is that obviously the collective West is going to respond to these processes and to these structural changes. But the question mark I have here is whether it will be an adequate response and which part of the collective West will, let's say, survive and which part will sort of undergo kind of, from decline towards demise kind of process, which sometimes is good because each demise means also rebirth of something, let's say, new.
So Ayodi, perhaps you could give us a perspective from the global south, especially of how you see the West responding to the clear changes that we've seen over the past few years.
Well, I'd like to give a more sort of global picture and then come to the global south. I couldn't agree more that we're in between two worlds. I couldn't agree more that there is a decline, but I don't think it's just a decline of the West. I think it's a decline of our understanding of what globalization means, of what multilateralism means. It's an understanding, there's a decline in trust globally, and what that is manifesting itself as is this bifurcation, this schism between our worlds. The post-World War II order, and I mentioned this earlier, was created in the image and likeness of Europe, to fix Europe. It was created to fix a horrific world war, and that was just and it was right at the time. But we as a world have not adapted. The threats are now not in Europe, although there is currently one in the Ukraine. And again, we're leaning into that because it's almost a justification of right, this is why multilateralism exists, you know? But the threats have been in Africa, they've been in parts of Asia. There's conflict, there's crisis, there's hunger, there's climate change, all of these polycrises that we're dealing with as a global community. But we have, again, centered our focus on Europe or centered our focus on those Bretton Woods institutions, centered our focus on those in which the image and likeness of this structure that you and I exist in was created to serve. When I say the image and likeness, I say even the leadership of many of those institutions has looked like those who it was created to serve. And yet we're in a world, you talk as an economist, we're in a world where poverty is plummeting. We talked about ending poverty. We all remember those songs, you know, Do They Know It's Christmas? And all the, you know, maybe sometimes offensive lyrics that we've heard over the years, but very well-meaning people who have tried to end poverty. Poverty is at its highest rate. We have over 350 million people today in humanitarian crises around the world. That number would have increased in the last week as we saw the events unfold in Syria, as we see events unfold in Lebanon. We're living in dangerous, critical times. And when I talk from the Global South, I'm from Nigeria, but I have represented Africa. I led the Africa Vaccine Delivery Alliance during COVID. I saw the broken trust there. You know, there's a beautiful quote from President Ramaphosa, who will next year lead the G20 presidency, where he talks about, we felt like beggars during the pandemic. We felt like beggars waiting for crumbs to fall from the table. We were left behind. We're not dealing with our history, and if we don't deal with our history, we cannot deal with our future. We're not dealing with our history because we're not acknowledging, you know, the world is so afraid of reparations that we're not acknowledging that palaces and entire cities and countries were built off the backs of slavery, were built off the backs of pillaging diamonds and gold and human resources from certain parts of the world that I come from, parts of Asia, Latin America. These are the historical hurts and the realities that in many ways we are coming to the fore today. We are beginning it's a reckoning, I would say. It is a moment of reckoning, and how are we as a world going to deal with that reckoning? Are we going to bury our heads in? Are we going to go into nationalism and say, okay, it's all about me and myself? Or are we going to open our arms and embrace the rest of the world and say, let us fix this together? We must rebuild trust. We must rebalance power. You know, people don't like the word colonialism or decolonization, and I refer to it more as a rebalancing of power. We need a new paradigm that rebalances power. That power recognizing that the 1.5 almost billion people from my continent, Africa, the 1.4 billion from India, the 1-point-something billion in China, Latin America, those young populations are the future. They are not the past. They are the future. And what we're looking at from our perspective now is fear. There seems to be a fear that comes from the so-called West of being infiltrated. You know, just now we heard about migration being the risk. They're all coming over to take over our countries. But how about we see it as a togetherness, about building a global economy together, about building a global system together that is not about them versus us, but that we rebalance the power so that we create a future for our children and for our grandchildren that will exist, because right now we're heading into potential oblivion.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you bring up the Bretton Woods system. Of course, that was set up, as you say, after World War II to deal with an emerging global system that was mainly dominated at that point by the United States in a war-torn Europe. As you say, it was to solve that problem. It was a hammer for a particular type of nail. I think at that point in time, when the Bretton Woods system was set up, the Global South was basically viewed in two ways. It was viewed as being potentially communist, actually, and so that was, if it went into the Eastern Bloc, it was seen as being outside of the Bretton Woods system. I think China was outside of the Bretton Woods system for a long time, and it was also seen as quite impoverished, and therefore that the solution, if you want to say, within the Bretton Woods system was some sort of foreign aid, and that's what kind of grew up over time. Apart from that, the Bretton Woods system envisaged basically a free trading world. Outside of the communist bloc. All of that seems to be coming apart right now. I mean, one of the most obvious trends that we've seen, not just since the Trump administration in 2016, but also carried on by the Biden administration, is a retreat from free trade in many ways. And it's not really clear what is going to replace this. There hasn't been an active idea of what to replace this. There hasn't been, for example, a new British imperialist system, which was in its own way a protectionist entity. So we're kind of floating in the ether. Valina, I wonder what you make of these developments. Do you think really we are going into this new protectionist, isolationist world, or are we deluding ourselves into thinking that we can fight the tides of free trade?
What I think is happening is an interplay of several simultaneously happening processes. Yes, we are dealing with a lot of isolationism and protectionism when it comes to what I already said, the Western response, the reactionary kind of view of what's going on. And when you feel helpless as a state actor to prevent certain things from happening while they are still happening, because it's a cyclical and systemic process. You cannot stop it. Yes, but at the same time, we are also having the counter process of further integration, as many of the states in the Global South will still look for options that are based on free trade and trade relations. And actually, the key word is development, not so much trade, because development is the new religion of the Global South in terms of prosperity for the many and not for the few. And development can only emerge out of actually framework that settles the relationships between neighbors. Most of the integration that will happen will be regionalized. It will happen in certain areas, in certain geographic areas. And yes, there will be probably some sort of regional, let's say, power that will facilitate the framework, which will not necessarily come from the West. So we will have more options here as well. We have China, which is going to still be a global trade and manufacturing power for the next decades, whether we like it or not. I mean, depending on the view and the perspective in the corner of the world, we are going to have probably a reviving Russia. That's something that the Westerners don't like to hear, but the way they are responding to the war is actually feeding into and helping Russia win in the long term. And then we have India, which is re-emerging on the global arena. Okay, so we have these kind of issues. And then we have the bifurcation and the macro perspective. That is a bifurcation related to the Bretton Woods system, to the financial network, to the capital markets, to the economic and trade system, and to the markets of commodities. Everything is going to be bifurcated because of the systemic decoupling between the United States and China. And nobody can give us an answer as to how the final outcome will look like of this systemic decoupling. Nobody wants that, especially the Global South. Why? Because they don't want to be caught in a binary world where they will have to face another situation of having to take sides, being, presented only with two options, where there is a third option, which is linked to the development. So all of this is a trilemma, and this trilemma leads to various approaches, various solutions, depending on, first and foremost, the preparedness of the leadership. in each of these countries. The leadership, the mindset, is it a mindset linked to reactionary approach, or is it a mindset linked to strategic foresight and to openness, as my colleague said, and to trying to actually build on opportunities instead of animosities? So
Ayode, you're actually from an adjacent, or you're affiliated with an adjacent organization to the Bretton Woods, the original Bretton Woods system. The G7 is sort of an adjunct, as it were, to the Bretton Woods system. And as I said, it was based once upon a time on a very openness. The G7 then expanded into the G20 and so on. Now that still exists. But how do you view this? I mean, from being adjacent to from being inside an institution that is set up for this kind of openness, development. It's obviously tied to the World Bank, which is well, in theory anyway, is supposed to promote development and so on. And now we're seeing this retreat. I mean, how does it come across to you? And do you think it's sustainable?
Well, first of all, I'm not from the institution when, unfortunately, in the world of today, when many of these institutions try to rebalance power, they find a woman, a black woman, or somebody, we find a token and we put it in and we call it a chair. So really that's what I am. I'm not from the system. I'm Nigerian, proudly Nigerian. I call myself a Nubian princess. I have a husband who's Brazilian and Welsh, a daughter who's Fijian, Brazilian, Welsh and Nigerian. I tell them that I'm the only true global South person in our household. I jest. So I'm not from inside the system. I've been brought in to be a participant, to be a voice, to help to rebalance that power, to help to bring some of the flavor of which is a good thing. I'm not knocking that. That is a very good thing. And I find myself in those rooms often saying, I'm here, don't talk about us as though we're outside the room. We're here. We are a part of this world. And to what my colleague just said, and talk about leadership, because that really is what it's about. We look at a world where really leadership has been manipulated across much of Africa and other parts of the world. And we're beginning to see that now has been manipulated to help to serve the interests of global powers, to serve the interests of the West. We're seeing where, leaders are literally being put in place. We've seen regime changes, and we're not supposed to talk about it, but it is the reality. And that is because there is a vested interest in keeping us at a certain level. There's a vested interest in keeping parts of Africa poor, broke, and down in the dumps. That is my belief. And so we're now seeing in Africa, we're seeing blocks forming. We're seeing something that people don't like, but in the Sahel, self-determination, we're seeing countries like Mali, Guinea and Equatorial Guinea and others. We're seeing them say, no, enough is enough. The world hasn't liked it. They've called it military coups. They've said it is not democracy. But who defines what democracy is? Who defines what democracy is to those people? Because right now, they are suddenly free of debt. They are suddenly creating their own trading system and currency between themselves. They are suddenly taking control of their own tin and copper and their own military bases. Senegal has just thrown France out and said, no, we will control our own destiny and our own future. And in doing so, they are grabbing control of their economy. So how about this system where we in Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world take control of our own destiny? How about we stop trying to copy the models of the West? How about we stop trying to be like what the West told us to be like? And we start internally we talked about reflexivity earlier, looking at our own selves and saying, this is the way our economy is going to grow. Because the reality is we will be the majority of the world's population in not so many years. Already my country, Nigeria, is projected to be the 5th largest country in the world. The reason we are currently failing is because we are trying to model ourselves after a system that was not created for us. We're trying to model ourselves, we're trying to do the things that we have been told to do in the way that we have been told to do them. We have been told to do them in that way because it was easy then for the West to come in and take gold and to go into South Africa and take diamonds and to go into Egypt and India. I mean, we're all still begging for the return of Benin bronzes and for many of our artifacts and our treasures, that countries are literally telling us we will lend them to you because we do not trust you to be able to take care of them. You know, we're here in a beautiful museum where we can see artifacts and various beautiful things that belong to this country. Ours have been taken from us because we've been told, no, you cannot look after them. It is time that that world changes. And that world is not going to change, unfortunately, I don't think, with our generation. But I am hopeful for a future where the generation to come, the young ones coming, will understand their own right to self-determination, will understand that the systems that the West has prescribed for us as being the right systems may not necessarily be so. And whether we're called the global South, the global Middle, or the global whatever we're called, that we have our own responsibility to future generations, looking into history and changing the past.
And we actually hear from my colleague where the key to solution lies, because the future of global geopolitics is not only going to be about who is controlling the narrative, the global narrative, but also, while obviously following, you know, their national interests, but also who is successfully communicating locally. Right. Because most of the solutions linked to decarbonization, linked to climate change, linked to the most precarious period of international politics over the last 30 and by extension 70 years, not only when it comes to refugees, migration, slavery, indebtedness, and the number of military conflicts and wars. All of this is at peak, so nothing has worked. Nothing that has been provided by the current global players has really worked. So the solutions, and this is the future, to end up with a positive narrative, it lies in the local communities and in the nations, within the communities, in the local populations, in the people themselves. When it comes to decarbonization, when it comes to new economic solutions, when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution and riding the wave of digitalization, and so on and so forth. So structures, this time will be also localized, and solutions will be localized.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that fits very much with the opening theme of this morning's Budapest Global Dialogue, where Balázs Orbán said we're entering an age of sovereignty. And it certainly feels that way. The old global system is probably not fit for purpose anymore. There's no point really in making judgment about it now. It led some development and so on, and it had some downsides, but that seems to be the end, and it does seem to be that we're entering a world of an age of global sovereignty now. So thank you both for coming to the Budapest Global Dialogue, and thank you both for sitting down with me. It's been really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Philip.